The book of the prophet Daniel is found among the prophetic books of the Old Testament, and he is the last of the major prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. He's found following the book of the prophet Ezekiel and preceding the book of the prophet Hosea, which is the first of the minor prophets in the Old Testament. Daniel itself is not a product of prophetic literature, the way we would see Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, and others. It is not a prophetic book, although there is prophecy in it, but rather the literature is classified as apocalyptic literature. The reason we traditionally place it among the prophetic books is that the main character is a prophet in the story itself. The character named Daniel, a name that means God is my judge. And he perhaps is based upon a well-known literary figure, or perhaps even a historical figure, who was known for his impeccable and perhaps divinely inspired judgment. Very much like the story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and then owning up to it to his father because he could not tell a lie, while the story itself is a folk tale to emulate and emphasize the impeccable honesty of our first president in the United States, the story itself is not historical, even if the main character is a historical figure and was the President of the United States. The same can be said for the book of Daniel. The stories within the book of Daniel are sketchy at best in terms of their historical accuracy, but the main character may have been based on a well-known figure named Daniel, known for his impeccable judgment. One thing to remember about the book of Daniel is that it is a book of dualism, a book of twos. The number 2 isn't a prominent number in the book itself with symbolic value, but rather it has many settings of 2. For example, the book of Daniel has 2 settings. We have the story setting in the Babylonian exile during the 6th century BC, and you have the author's setting in writing the book, which would be between 168 and 165 BC in the 2nd century. There are 2 canons, or 2 forms, in the book of Daniel. There's the ancient Hebrew canon, and then there's the ancient Greek canon, the Greek translation of the book of Daniel. The ancient Hebrew canon consists of chapters 1 through 12, while the ancient Greek translation of the book of Daniel, put together after the Hellenization of the Middle East following the conquest of Alexander the Great, the Greek text of Daniel includes chapters 13 and 14, the stories of Susanna and the story of Bel and the dragon. There are 2 languages in the Hebrew canon of Daniel. The first is the Hebrew language, while the second is Aramaic. Starting in chapter 2, verse 4 of the book of Daniel, and carrying on through chapter 7, the original language of those stories is Aramaic, while in chapters 1 and 8 through 12, the original language is Hebrew. So we have 2 settings, 2 forms or canons, and 2 languages in which these stories are told. Finally, and perhaps the most commonly known, is that there are 2 literary forms in the book of Daniel. We have one, the court tales, chapters 1 through 6. And second, the apocalyptic visions, chapters 7 through 12. The court tales, as we all know, are the stories of the food test, in which the young Daniel refuses the food offered to him by the Babylonian stewards as part of his enculturization into Babylonian society. The second is the story of Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the statue, which Daniel interprets for him. The third is the well-known story of the men in the fiery furnace, while the fourth, in chapter 4, is perhaps the not-so-well-known story of Nebuchadnezzar's vision of the tree, in which God takes Nebuchadnezzar's sanity away, removing his power as king, and then later gives it back in the restoration of Nebuchadnezzar's sanity. Fifth, we have the story, well known, of the hand writing on the wall during the reign and a banquet of King Belteshazzar, who was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel interpreting that story as the end of Belteshazzar's reign and the end of the Babylonian kingdom. And following that fall, finally in chapter 6 is the story of Daniel in the lion's den, perhaps the best known and most beloved story from the book of Daniel. In the apocalyptic visions, on the other hand, we have in chapter 7 the vision of the four beasts. In chapter 8, the vision of the ram and the he-goat, followed by the vision of Gabriel and his interpretation of the 70 weeks prophesied by Jeremiah. And finally, in chapters 10 through 12, the vision of the Hellenistic wars, perhaps the most thinly veiled vision, indicating the history of Israel and the Jewish people between the Babylonian exile and the writing of the book of Daniel, which was around the time of the Maccabean revolt in the mid-2nd century. So that's important to remember as we examine the stories and especially the apocalyptic visions in the book of the prophet Daniel.